Mother-in-law tried to cancel my wedding. I canceled her retirement. Charlotte, sweetheart, I called the venue and told them there was a family emergency. The wedding is postponed indefinitely. Those words came out of my mother-in-law's mouth with such casual cruelty that I almost didn't process them at first. My name is Charlotte Evans, I'm 28 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant for Morrison & Associates in Denver, Colorado. It was exactly 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, 3 days before my wedding, when Margaret Thompson, my soon-to-be mother-in-law, decided to drop this bombshell via phone call. I was sitting in my apartment, surrounded by wedding favors and final preparations when she delivered what she clearly thought was a death blow to my happiness. You see, dear, she continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness, Thomas deserves better than some working girl who thinks she can just waltz into our family. I found someone much more suitable, Rebecca Whitman from the country club. Her father owns 3 car dealerships. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't even raise my voice. Instead, I said simply, "Thank you for letting me know, Margaret. Have a good evening," and hung up. Something changed inside me that night. You see, when you spend your days following money trails and uncovering financial fraud for a living, you develop a very particular set of skills. And when someone tries to destroy your life, well, sometimes karma needs a little professional assistance. Let me back up and tell you how this all started. I met Thomas Thompson 2 years ago at a charity gala for the Denver Children's Hospital. He was charming, successful, and came from what everyone called a good family. His mother, Margaret, had been the chief financial officer at Pinnacle Healthcare Solutions for nearly 25 years, and she never let anyone forget it. She lived in a sprawling house in Cherry Hills Village, drove a Mercedes, and treated everyone like they were auditioning for her approval. From the moment Thomas introduced us, Margaret made it crystal clear that I wasn't good enough for her son. It started with small comments. "Oh, you work with numbers too? How practical." Or my personal favorite, Thomas has always been attracted to unique girls. The word unique was always delivered with the same tone most people reserve for discussing intestinal parasites. But Thomas loved me, and I loved him. We got engaged after 18 months, and despite Margaret's increasingly obvious disapproval, we began planning our dream wedding. That's when things got interesting. The first sign of trouble came 6 weeks before the wedding. Our florist called, confused, saying someone claiming to be the mother of the bride had called to simplify our floral arrangements. When I called the venue to confirm our menu selections, they seemed surprised. Hadn't my representative already changed everything to a much smaller, cheaper package? Each time, I calmly corrected the changes and made detailed notes. Date, time, vendor, exactly what was said. You don't survive in forensic accounting without being methodical about documentation. Thomas, bless his heart, kept insisting his mother would never do such things. "She's just protective," he'd say. "She'll come around." I began to suspect that Thomas had been sheltered from his mother's true nature his entire life. The breaking point came with that phone call. After I hung up on Margaret, I sat in silence for exactly 10 minutes processing what had just happened. Then I did what I do best. I started following the money. You see, something had always bothered me about Margaret Thompson. For someone making a CFO salary at a mid-sized healthcare company, she lived an extremely lavish lifestyle. The house, the cars, the jewelry, the constant vacations, it all seemed a bit much, even for someone in her position. I started with public records, property purchases, vehicle registrations, business filings, all perfectly legal to access if you know where to look. What I found was interesting. Margaret's house was purchased for $1.2 million in cash in 2018. Her Mercedes was also a cash purchase. In fact, almost everything was paid for in cash, which is unusual for someone in corporate America who would have access to favorable financing. But that was just the beginning. At 2:30 a.m., unable to sleep, I started cross-referencing Margaret's lifestyle against her probable salary range. Even being generous with estimates, the numbers didn't add up. Not even close. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I'd never done for non-medical reasons in my entire career. I had some investigating to do. I started with social media. Margaret was surprisingly active on Facebook and Instagram, posting constantly about her purchases, trips, and activities. She was meticulous about documenting her life, which turned out to be a critical mistake on her part. I created a timeline of her major purchases and trips over the past 5 years, complete with dates and amounts where she'd been foolish enough to share them. The woman had spent over $400,000 that I could document, and that was just from what she'd posted publicly. Then I got creative. Using my professional database access, perfectly legal for due diligence research, I ran a comprehensive background Check on Margaret Thompson. What I found made my blood run cold. Margaret had been married before Thomas's father. She'd been Margaret Kowalski, married to a man named David Kowalski from 1987 to 1991. The marriage ended in divorce after David discovered she'd been siphoning money from his construction business. No charges were filed. David just wanted her. Gone. But it got better. In 1995, 2 years after marrying Richard Thompson, Thomas's father, she'd been investigated by the Colorado Department of Revenue for tax irregularities. Again, no charges were filed, but there were definitely red flags. By noon, I had enough circumstantial evidence to suggest a pattern going back decades. But I needed more than suggestions. I needed proof. That's when I remembered something Thomas had mentioned months ago. Margaret had been complaining about their new Snoopy accounting firm at Pinnacle Healthcare. Apparently, the company had switched to a more rigorous auditing system the previous year, and Margaret was not happy about the increased oversight. I made a phone call to a former colleague, Janet Morrison, who now worked for a consulting firm that specialized in healthcare fraud investigation. We met for coffee at 3 p.m. Hypothetically, I said, if someone wanted to anonymously report suspected financial irregularities at a healthcare company, how would they go about it? Janet raised an eyebrow. Hypothetically, they'd contact both the company's board of directors and the Colorado Division of Securities. Healthcare fraud is taken very seriously, especially if it involves federal Medicare or Medicaid funds. I nodded thoughtfully. And hypothetically, what kind of evidence would be most useful? Pattern documentation, lifestyle analysis comparing reported income to actual expenditures, any evidence of unusual cash transactions. The authorities have tools to dig deeper once they have a credible starting point. That evening, I sat down and compiled everything I'd found into a comprehensive report. 23 pages of meticulously documented evidence suggesting that Margaret Thompson had been living far beyond her legitimate means for years. But I still needed one more piece of the puzzle. I called Thomas. Honey, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course, Charlotte, what is it? Your mother called the venue and canceled our wedding. There was a long pause. That's not possible. She wouldn't do that. Thomas, she told me herself. She also told me that she's picked out someone else for you to marry. Rebecca Whitman from your country club. Another pause. Longer this time. I need to talk to her. Before you do that, I need you to answer one question. Has your mother ever asked you to sign financial documents that you didn't fully understand? What? I mean, sometimes she handles investments for me. Yes. She's good with money? Why? My heart sank. Margaret had been using her own son as an unwitting accomplice. Thomas, I need you to gather every financial document your mother has ever had you sign and bring them to me tomorrow. Don't tell her you're doing it. Charlotte, you're scaring me. Good. You should be scared. I think your mother has been stealing money for years, and she might have implicated you without your knowledge. The next morning, Thomas arrived at my apartment with a box of documents and a pale, frightened expression. I found these in her study. Charlotte, some of these papers, I don't remember signing some of these. I spent 4 hours going through everything. What I found was even worse than I'd suspected. Margaret had been systematically embezzling funds from Pinnacle Healthcare for at least 7 years. But she'd been clever about it. Instead of stealing cash directly, she'd been manipulating vendor payments and insurance reimbursements, skimming small percentages from hundreds of transactions. The money was being funneled through a series of shell companies, several of which were registered in Thomas's name without his knowledge. Margaret had been forging his signature for years, creating a paper trail that implicated her son in her crimes. But here's where it gets really diabolical. Margaret had been building this elaborate financial house of cards specifically to fund her retirement. She'd planned to pin everything on Thomas if she ever got caught, then disappear with her ill-gotten gains. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just about canceling my wedding. This was about a criminal conspiracy that could destroy the man I loved and ruin dozens of other lives in the process. I made copies of everything and returned the originals to Thomas. Put these back exactly where you found them. Don't let her know you've discovered anything. What are you going to do? I'm going to stop her. That afternoon, I assembled my evidence package. The lifestyle analysis, the shell company documentation, the forged signatures, everything. But I saved the best for last. Remember how I mentioned Margaret loved documenting her life on social media? Well, it turns out she'd been particularly excited about a vacation to Cabo she'd taken in March. She'd posted dozens of photos, including several at expensive restaurants and luxury resorts. Here's the interesting part. Those photos were time-stamped during a week when Margaret had reported being sick with food poisoning, requesting reimbursement from the company for medical expenses she claimed prevented her from working. She'd literally documented her own fraud. On Monday morning, exactly 48 hours after Margaret had canceled my wedding, I walked into the offices of Pinnacle Healthcare Solutions and requested a meeting with the chairman of the board of directors. His name was William Crawford, and he was a serious man in his 70s who'd built his reputation on integrity and ethical business practices. I'd done my research. Mr. Crawford's grandfather had lost his construction company to embezzlement in the 1940s, and William had never forgotten the lesson. "Mr. Crawford," I said, "my name is Charlotte Evans, and I'm a forensic accountant with Morrison and Associates. I have reason to believe that one of your employees has been committing systematic financial fraud against your company for several years." I laid out everything: the timeline, the evidence, the methodology. Mr. Crawford listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "Miss Evans," he said finally, "how did you come across this information?" I told him the truth. The employee in question attempted to sabotage my wedding and explicitly told me she was doing it to prevent me from joining her family. That made me curious about what else she might be willing to do to get what she wants. Mr. Crawford was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Evans, I want you to know that Pinnacle Healthcare takes fraud extremely seriously. If what you're telling me is true, we will pursue every legal remedy available to us." "I understand, sir. There's one more thing you should know. I believe the employee has been using shell companies registered in her son's name to hide the stolen funds. Her son appears to be completely unaware of this and may himself be a victim of identity theft." That got his attention. "Are you certain the son is innocent?" "As certain as I can be without a formal investigation. The signature analysis alone suggests forgery, and his reaction when I showed him the documents was genuine shock and horror." Mr. Crawford nodded slowly. "We'll need to involve law enforcement, you understand? I would be disappointed if you didn't." By Wednesday afternoon, Margaret Thompson was sitting in an interview room at the Colorado Division of Securities trying to explain how she'd managed to afford a $1.2 million house on a CFO salary. The investigation moved quickly. When financial fraud investigators have a roadmap provided by a forensic accountant, they can accomplish in days what might otherwise take months. Margaret's computer was seized. Her bank records were subpoenaed. The shell companies were traced and frozen. Most damaging of all, her beloved social media accounts became a timeline of criminal activity that even the most expensive lawyers couldn't explain away. Thomas called me Thursday evening, sobbing. "Charlotte, they arrested my mother this morning. Federal agents came to her house with a warrant. They're saying she stole over $2 million. How are you holding up? I don't understand how this happened. How did she hide this from everyone for so long?" "She didn't hide it, Thomas. She just counted on no one caring enough to look closely." The local news picked up the story Friday morning. Healthcare CFO arrested in multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. The article mentioned that the investigation began after an anonymous tip from a financial professional. Margaret's bail was set at $500,000. Ironically, all of her assets were frozen as evidence, so she couldn't make bail. She would remain in custody, pending trial. But the real consequences were just beginning. Pinnacle Healthcare's board voted unanimously to terminate Margaret's employment and pursue full restitution through civil court. Her pension, built up over 25 years, was forfeit. Her 401k, which contained over $800,000, was seized to offset the company's losses. The IRS launched their own investigation for tax evasion. Turns out Margaret hadn't been reporting her stolen income on her tax returns, which added federal tax fraud to her growing list of charges. The house in Cherry Hills Village? Gone. The Mercedes? Repossessed. The jewelry, art, and furniture? All sold at auction to fund restitution payments. But here's my favorite part. Remember Rebecca Whitman, the woman Margaret thought would be a more suitable wife for Thomas? Well, Rebecca's father owned those 3 car dealerships, and he'd been a major client of Pinnacle Healthcare. When the fraud story broke, the Whitmans made it very clear they wanted nothing to do with the Thompson family. Margaret went from being the queen of Denver high society to being a cautionary tale in less than 2 weeks. The criminal trial took place 8 months later. Margaret's lawyers tried every defense they could think of. They claimed she was mentally ill. They claimed she was coerced by unknown conspirators. They even tried to blame Thomas, suggesting he was the real mastermind. None of it worked. The evidence was too comprehensive, too well documented, and too damning. Margaret Thompson was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $2.3 million in restitution. At age 63, she would be 75 when released, assuming she served her full sentence. But prison was just the beginning of Margaret's new reality. When she was finally released on parole after serving 8 years, Margaret discovered that her professional life was over. No financial services company would hire a convicted embezzler. Her CPA license had been revoked. Her professional network had abandoned her. At age 71, Margaret Thompson found herself working the night shift at a Walmart in suburban Denver, making $12.50 an hour, and living in a one-bedroom apartment in a part of town she would never have acknowledged existed in her previous life. The woman who had once decided I wasn't good enough for her son was now asking customers if they wanted their receipt in the bag. As for Thomas and me, we were married 6 months after Margaret's arrest. The venue was very understanding once they learned the circumstances, and several vendors actually offered discounts when the story became public. Thomas struggled with guilt and shame for years, despite being cleared of any wrongdoing. He eventually started therapy and learned to separate himself from his mother's crimes. It wasn't easy, but we worked through it together. We're happy now. Thomas works as a project manager for a renewable energy company, and I was promoted to senior partner at Morrison & Associates. We bought a modest house in a nice neighborhood and drive practical cars that we actually pay for legally. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about destroying Margaret's life. The answer is simple. I didn't destroy her life. I simply documented. Margaret Thompson made a series of choices over many years. She chose to steal. She chose to forge documents. She chose to implicate her own son in her crimes. And finally, she chose to try to destroy my happiness because she thought I was powerless to stop her. She was wrong about that last part. I often think about that phone call, the casual cruelty in her voice when she told me she'd canceled my wedding. Margaret thought she was dealing with some naive young woman who would simply accept being discarded. She had no idea she was dealing with someone who spent her professional life uncovering exactly the kind of crimes she'd been committing. Here's what I learned from this experience. Documentation is power. Patience is a weapon. And sometimes karma doesn't come naturally. Sometimes it needs professional assistance. 3 years later, I received a letter at my office. It was from Margaret, written on plain white paper in shaky handwriting. She wanted to apologize. She wanted to explain herself. Most of all, she wanted me to convince Thomas to visit her. I read the letter once, then fed it through my office shredder. Some bridges, once burned, should stay that way. Margaret Thompson taught me something valuable. Never underestimate the person you're trying to destroy. You might discover that they're much better at it than you are. Today, Thomas and I have been married for 4 years. We have a beautiful daughter named Emma who will never know her paternal grandmother. That's probably for the best. Sometimes I drive past that Walmart where Margaret works. I've never stopped in, but I've seen her through the windows. A tired old woman in a blue vest, scanning barcodes and being polite to customers who don't know her story. I don't take pleasure in her suffering, but I don't regret my role in bringing justice either. Margaret Thompson spent years stealing money from a healthcare company, money that could have gone toward patient care or employee benefits or research into saving lives. She stole it to fund a luxury lifestyle and tried to frame her own son when the walls started closing in. When someone tried to stop her from destroying another innocent person, she attempted to ruin their happiness out of pure spite. The woman, who once told me I wasn't good enough for her family, learned that character isn't determined by your bank balance or your zip code or your membership at the country club. Character is what you do when you think no one is watching. And Margaret Thompson, after years of being watched by someone professionally trained to see patterns in financial behavior, discovered that someone had been keeping very careful notes indeed. In the end, Margaret got exactly what she deserved. And Thomas and I got our happily ever after. Justice, it turns out, is a dish best served with proper documentation.